Good morning. My name is Stacy, and I will be your conference operator today. At this time, I would like to welcome everyone to the Voter Expansion Conference Call. All lines have been placed on mute to prevent any background noise. After the speaker's remarks, there will be a question-and-answer session. If you would like to ask a question during this time, simply press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. If you would like to withdraw your question, press the pound key. Thank you. Mr. Mo Lacey, you may begin your conference.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for getting on. This is Mo Lacey, the Communications Director at the DNC. I'm joined today by Pratt Wiley, who's the Director of Voter Expansion at the DNC, and also on the line with us is Maggie Toulouse-Oliver, who's the Democratic candidate for Secretary of State in the great state of New Mexico. And we just wanted to take a couple of minutes today to provide our thoughts and our perspective on yesterday's story in the New York Times about the Republican strategy, and it is a coordinated strategy, the Republican strategy to limit voting in swing states. This isn't a new story. It is something we've been seeing percolating for quite some time. They're just getting more brazen about it. And let's be very, very clear what this is. This is an attempt by the Republican Party to shrink the electorate because they know when the electorate is large, they lose. When the electorate is smaller, they win. It is crass. It is purely political. It is undemocratic. But it is what they are doing because they know. They know. Reince Priebus, the chair of the Republican National Committee himself, says that they believe they are the party that cannot lose a midterm but cannot win a presidential election. Why do they say that? Because they know that turnout is smaller in midterms, and so they're going to keep trying to drive down turnout every chance they get. And they seem to be starting in the battleground states, the states that not only are having competitive races this year, but will be competitive in a presidential election. These are two very different approaches to the most fundamental right we have, the right to vote. Two very different approaches by the two political parties. They are trying to restrict the vote. They know that they can't win unless they rig the system. We've seen it in places like Texas, Alabama, Arizona, and Kansas, where they're passing strict photo ID and proof of citizenship laws that make it more difficult for eligible voters who change their name to vote. We're seeing them restrict early voting periods in states like Wisconsin, Ohio, and North Carolina. Can someone please explain to me how limiting the number of hours makes democracy safer and stronger? I'd argue it does the exact opposite. We're seeing them tell college students that they can't vote on their college campuses. Making voting more difficult does not serve democracy. It does not help anybody except for the Republican Party. And I fundamentally believe that there is a fatal flaw in any political party whose entire strategy rests on shrinking the electorate. You cannot survive. But they're going to give it a shot. Democrats are very different. We believe that we should expand democracy, that expanding democracy is good for the nation, it is good for our party. But as Bill Clinton said a few weeks ago, we've never solved any problems with less democracy in our nation. To talk about that a little bit, I'm going to hand it over to Pratt to talk a little bit about the voter expansion project that we've launched to not only counter what the Republicans are doing on the ground, but get proactive and make it easier for people to vote. And then he'll hand it over to Maggie to talk about what she's seeing on the ground in her race for Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mo. Thank you, everyone. And it's a pleasure to be with you all today. I'm just going to move a little bit closer to the phone. We launched the Voter Expansion Project about a month ago. But the Voter Expansion Project really represents about 10 years worth of migration, of changing the way that we think about not just protecting the vote, but expanding the vote. Not just being on offense, but being on defense. The charge of the voter expansion project is really simple. To make sure that every eligible voter can register, to make sure that every registered voter can vote, and to make sure that every vote is accurately counted. It really is that simple. It's hard in practice, but the goal itself is very clear. Part of why we're doing this, part of why this change in framework reflects the fact that not only, again, are you seeing greater threats by Republicans, are you seeing the cynical attempt by Republicans to make voting more difficult for their own partisan gain. But what we're also seeing is that we've reached a moment in election administration where we can greatly improve the voting experience for the vast majority of Americans. We can use everyday technology. We can use best practices, not just from elections, but also from corporate America and everyday life, to improve the process for everyone. We can use online registration. We can use same-day registration. We can use online poll books and electronic poll books. We can have larger early voting periods and longer hours that make voting more convenient for modern Americans in today's society. We've reached a really, in some ways, it's that crossroads moment. There's a clear path to easy, accessible voting that will increase turnout on one side, and there's a path that will make voting harder, that we know will make voting harder on the other side. What we do, first and foremost, we try to educate voters on the rules. We spend a lot of time with this effort in particular for one really simple reason. We know by far and away the most effective tactic in terms of minimizing problems on Election Day is a well-informed, well-trained voter. When they know what the rules are, they're going to vote properly. They're not going to cast provisional ballots. They're not going to hold up lines with confusion. They're not going to go to the wrong polling location. We do this by training our candidates. We do this by working closely with our coordinated campaigns, with our state parties, with our allied groups, to train campaign staff, campaign volunteers, and voters at large. Secondly, what we do is we engage with election administrators. Second only to voter education, a well-trained, a well-resourced election administrator is going to solve the vast majority of problems that you encounter on Election Day, making sure that they have the tools and the resources that they need in order to run a fair, a free election. Thirdly, we advocate for legislation that's expanding access. Again, online registration, same-day registration, automatic registration, expansive and convenient voting hours, upgrades when necessary to election equipment, election machines and tabulators. And finally, it's through litigation and our traditional voter protection role, being on the defense and making sure that if there are any problems on Election Day, that folks are able to exercise their rights without an undue burden. But we list those tools in order. We know, again, by far and away that litigation piece, that lawyer piece, is not nearly as important as the organizing piece, the training piece, and getting good laws on the books and having those good laws fairly implemented. One of the key factors to that is getting good people elected into these really important offices like Secretary of State, where you are the chief voting advocate on the behalf of people in your state, and that's why I'm really glad to be sharing the call with Maggie Toulouse-Oliver, who can talk a little bit more about what it is that she's seeing on the ground and ways that we can use these offices to increase participation in democracy and not decrease it.
Thank you, Pratt. As Pratt mentioned, my name is Maggie Toulouse-Oliver. Currently, I am the county clerk in Bernalillo County, which is the Albuquerque metropolitan area here in New Mexico. It's about a third of the state's voting population resides within my county, and I've been serving in this role. It's an elected role here for the past 7 years. And as Mo also mentioned, I am running for Secretary of State here in New Mexico this year, and I'm running for a lot of the reasons that have been discussed already on the call today. And let me just start by saying what I believe is the most important fundamental role of an elections official, either in my current role as county clerk or the Secretary of State, which is to be a fair and impartial arbiter of the election process. And everything that I have done in my role as county clerk has been with that fair and impartial hat on. I believe it's extremely important for our elections to be conducted without impunity, and in order for that to happen, every decision that has to be made cannot be made from a partisan point of view, such as is being discussed on this call today. We've successfully expanded the access to the ballot box here in Bernalillo County in a very, I think, nonpartisan way, in a very efficient way. We've expanded early voting. We've created vote centers on Election Day that allow individuals to vote at any vote center that's convenient for them. We're using the electronic poll books that Pratt discussed. And so we're doing a lot of things. We're providing the training and information and voter education that Pratt also mentioned to the voters here in Bernalillo County so that they can effectively and conveniently cast their ballot. Unfortunately, that is not happening all over the state of New Mexico, and so the reason that I am running is to ensure that we do see more access to the ballot box. I think one of the most glaring examples of this problem occurred in 2012 in Chaparral, which is near the border between New Mexico and Mexico. It's also very close to Texas. And United States citizens living in this community had to wait in line for up to 6 hours in the cold of night with state law enforcement and crime scene tape wrapped around this polling location in order to prevent volunteers from providing assistance, from providing water, and from providing translation services to the voters who were standing in line after work in the dark because the county clerk in that county had not made sure to provide enough voting booths and voting machines at that site in order to accommodate the voters. And in addition, there had not been an early voting site in that community, although right across the road in the neighboring county, there had been an early voting site for the voters of that county. And so I think that's a perfect example. You know, I think we're seeing some very obvious tactics such as strict photo voter ID and rolling back of early voting hours that are very obvious ways of repressing the vote. And I think things like not providing enough voting booths and voting machines in the site are a less obvious but also very effective way at preventing voters from casting their ballot, because often voters will just get frustrated and leave. And in fact, in this particular situation in 2012, the poll workers supposedly ran out of provisional ballots and couldn't even provide voters with an option to vote provisionally, which of course is mandated by federal law. And so that's one example of things that have happened here in New Mexico. The other example that I think is really important to talk about is the fact that early voting really is applied differently between different counties and in different elections. And so, for example, in New Mexico, the city of Albuquerque is a home-ruled government and has its own appointed city clerk who is appointed by the Republican mayor here. And in their elections, they decided to use completely different early voting sites from what we use across the county, which is basically made up of Albuquerque during a county-run election. And so, for example, the early voting site at the University of New Mexico was not maintained in the last city election. And that was done deliberately to prevent the young people, students, and members of the University of New Mexico community from being able to cast a ballot at that location. And I want to mention that these types of things, they're not just affecting minority voters. I mean, here in New Mexico, we're a majority minority state. But these restrictions are not just impacting people of color. They're impacting young people. They're impacting students. They're impacting the elderly. They're impacting women who oftentimes just due to a name change, particularly with strict photo voter ID laws, are not able to cast a ballot. So I think, these types of ostensible, election integrity measures are really doing the exact opposite. They are preventing voters, legitimate citizens, from casting a ballot. That is not election integrity. That is voter suppression. And so the reason I'm running in this state is to put an end to that type of behavior. We have a current Secretary of State here who hired a Republican political operative to work in her office to implement policies to prevent people from being able to vote. And this is, again, just another way in which we see this same partisanship, dressed as election administration going on here in the state of New Mexico, just as it is happening nationally. And those of us who believe strongly in democracy and democratic participation know that needs to come to an end. And so with that, I'll be happy to hand it back to Mo, and of course I will remain on the call for questions.
Thanks. And this is Pratt. I just want to hammer home that last point, which I think is so important. First of all, these laws do affect every household. We're not just talking about voter ID. We're talking about ways that are more difficult for folks to register, ways that are less convenient for folks to vote, changes, late-minute changes in polling locations. By far and away, the folks who are most harmed by this collection of voting laws and suppressive tactics are women, by far and away. Young people, first-time voters, working families, single parents, people of color certainly, the elderly certainly, but these aren't just targeted against one group or one constituency. And also it's important to keep in mind that this isn't isn't isolated to one part of the country. This isn't just a southern problem. This isn't a problem that actually only, this really does touch every single corner of the country. You've got states in the Midwest, you've got states in the South, you've got states in the West where you see these types of tactics. And I think that Maggie's comments were dead on, and we're glad to see so many of you paying attention. Thank you.
All right, and with that, operator, we're happy to take calls.
At this time, I would like to remind everyone, in order to ask a question, press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. We'll pause for just a moment to compile the Q&A roster. Your first question comes from Deborah Berry from Gannett, Washington.
Yeah, thank you for the call. Mo or Pratt, you didn't mention Mississippi in your efforts. Could you talk about Mississippi, particularly since it has one of the newest voter ID laws? And also, can you talk about the prospects of the VRA legislation on the Hill?
Sure. The only reason why we didn't mention Mississippi is because, quite honestly, there are too many states to name. But just by way of background, Mississippi, which had an ID law already on the books, is now doing a stricter form of identification. I think the jury is still out on Mississippi and how that law is going to affect people. They have not yet had their first election yet with the new law in place. That comes, I think, June is the primary. There have been some encouraging signs from the state that at least they recognize, unlike some of the other states, that they need to invest in voter education. But unfortunately, there are going to be a lot of folks who are not going to be able to engage in the political process because of this new ID law in Mississippi. And actually, I want to talk to you guys in a way that connects Mississippi with Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, where the voter ID law is currently suspended by the courts, and where there was litigation, oral arguments just a couple of months ago, I'm sorry, there's an organization that helps people who don't have IDs obtain IDs. And the reason why they do this is because most folks who don't have IDs, almost by definition, are not adept at negotiating social services and obtaining what they need from their state. 3 out of 4 of the folks who were helped by this organization simply lacked the documentation necessary to obtain an ID. And more often than not, what you would see is that they were folks who had been born, more often than not, in the South at a time before folks who were born outside of hospitals were given birth certificates, which was a very common practice really before 1960. All right, so we're talking about baby boomers and older who might not have the necessary identification in order to vote. So we're looking at Mississippi very closely because we know that from other states they're going to have some problems.
Your next question comes from the line of Myra Pena from LA Opinion.
Yes, from La Opinion. Thank you for taking my question. And I was wondering if, in addition to voter suppression tactics, if you could speak a bit about the Latino turnout this year. Normally they don't participate as fully as in presidential elections, but I was wondering if that has to do with their growing disillusionment with the Obama administration and obviously their frustration with Republicans as well when it comes to immigration reform. And what are you guys doing to get out the vote among Hispanics for the midterms? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. This is Mo Alafi. And then I'll kick it off, and then I don't know if anyone else wants to weigh in. But a couple of weeks ago, the Republican Party, the Republican National Committee, celebrated the one-year anniversary of its autopsy report, in which it said, that it was going to do a better job of outreach to Hispanics and the Latino community, and touted all these new organizers that they were placed out in the field. And when the chairman of the Republican Party went on national television and was asked about how they intended to do that outreach with all that staff, if the party leadership was still fractured and against comprehensive immigration reform, he said, look, we're putting the staff out there into the communities to do this outreach where we haven't done it before. It doesn't even really matter what the message is. That's only a slight paraphrase. It doesn't even really matter what the message is. I think that speaks to exactly the problem in the Republican Party. It speaks exactly to why I think so many people in the community are abandoning them. We are seeing polls that show more and more the Hispanic and Latino communities walking away from the Republican Party because there's just a fundamental disconnect there. I don't care how many staffers you put in the community if the message is flawed. And I'm sorry, the definition of outreach cannot be, I am going to send staff into your community so you can listen to us, but I am going to restrict your ability to vote because I don't want to hear from you. That's the message that the Republican Party is sending to the Hispanic and the Latino community. We need to continue to work hard to fight for the community. We as Democrats, we need to continue our outreach effort. We need to not take the community for granted. And yes, it is a midterm election, and this is one of the challenges, is that turnout is down across the board. That's what the Republican Party counts on, that it is going to be down. So they can blow as much smoke as they want. They can try as many tactical smoke and mirror efforts as they'd like. But at the end of the day, make no mistake, they are counting on lower turnout, and they are counting on creating lower turnout with obstacles to voting in the hopes that that further depresses the vote and it helps them in the midterm elections. They might be successful in that. They might be successful in that. That is why we are working so hard at voter registration and voter turnout this year. But I don't think it is a recipe for the long-term viability of the Republican Party, because at some point they can only throw up so many obstacles before those obstacles are overrun.
This is Maggie. I just want to point out on that point very quickly that you know, a lot of the efforts that we're seeing at restricting voter turnout, you know, while they do affect a wide variety of people across the race and ethnic continuum here in this country, that also, yes, it is true that minorities are impacted by these policies. And so I think often what ends up happening is there can be a response of increased turnout or increased enthusiasm in response to being told, you know, we're going to make it harder for you to vote. It's going to be more difficult for you to vote. And so, for example, here in New Mexico, the Secretary of State submitted a list of 64,000 registered voters to the state police claiming that they were quote-unquote non-citizens. And of course that list of voters here was predominantly Hispanic. And so I definitely think that that message that the Secretary of State was trying to remove Hispanic people from the voting rolls here in New Mexico is going to factor into this election campaign. And I think those individuals in particular are going to be targeted, you know, by me or by other campaigns saying, you know, did you know that your right to vote was almost taken away? And so I think actually what could end up happening is, as a result of these efforts, that these efforts completely backfire, especially with the Hispanic and Latino community, and that potentially we could see increased and improved turnout as a result of that, in response to that.
Your next question comes from the line of Zachary Ross with MSN.
Hi, Zachary Ross with MSNBC. The Ohio Democratic Party has said it likely plans to sue in response to the recent cutbacks to early voting. Have you guys talked with them about being involved with that, or are you considering litigation in response to any of these other recent voting restrictions?
So we never, I mean, with all due respect to MSNBC, I think it would be best that we not discuss our litigation strategies with the media before we discuss them with our partners. But I think there are a lot of organizations that are looking at what happened in Ohio and see a number of problems with what happened there, just as there were a number of organizations that looked to see what happened in Pennsylvania, just as there were a number of organizations to see what was happening in North Carolina. So we are often tracking that type of information, yes.
Your next question comes from the line of Chrissy Thompson, Cincinnati Enquirer.
Hi, thanks for taking the call. I wanted to ask you again about Ohio. We've seen a variety of laws passed this year, including some that your previous caller referenced. Can you give us some examples? I understand the philosophy behind your efforts here, but can you give us some examples of some tangible things that you plan to do? What's your best strategy for stopping these laws here in Ohio, or I guess turning the tide?
Well, you know, with Ohio's a great state to actually talk about the way that voter expansion works. I'm not going to discuss right now what specifically we're going to do, but let's talk about the ways that we're looking at this big picture. Ohio, over the last several years, has addressed problems in a number of different ways. The by far and away most effective process that Ohio engaged in ways to improve elections was the self-assessment that was conducted after the 2004 election. 2004 was an embarrassing moment for Ohio, with the long lines seen nationally. Everyone was watching what occurred, and then you had a real honest debate about ways to improve the electoral process. Since then, the way that voter expansion has worked to advance that cause has been a combination of organizing and litigation. Understanding that with the current composition of Ohio Republicans in the legislature, John Husted in the Secretary of State's office and Kasich in the governor's office, that you're not going to see good laws coming from Columbus. And so what you will see are efforts such as promoting the Voter Bill of Rights that is going to be a ballot initiative this cycle, and engaging with, organizing one-on-one conversations that are taking place hundreds of thousands of times over the course of the next several months to get that initiative on the ballot, to raise awareness of this issue. There also will undoubtedly be litigation. One of the sad things about Ohio is that the Ohio Republicans have had to be told by federal courts time and time again that the efforts that they have taken to restrict the vote simply are not legal, they're not constitutional, and they're anti-democratic. Eventually they will hopefully get the message, but until then, through a combination of people power and litigation power, is probably the way that you're going to see change.
This is Maggie. I just had a quick comment, a response to that question as well. So, again, using my home state as an example, because I can't speak to what the Democratic Party is planning to do in Ohio, but we used to have an annual reoccurrence of voter ID legislation that was introduced and pushed, I should say strict photo voter ID legislation that was introduced and pushed pretty far in our legislature, among other bills that featured voter suppression tactics. And 2 years ago, I worked together with a coalition to do exactly what Pratt's talking about with the voter expansion project here in New Mexico, and we pushed several pieces of legislation such as full online voter registration, expanded early voting sites in the rural parts of the state, and 16 and 17-year-old pre-registration, including the right for 17-year-olds to vote in primary elections. Interestingly, we pushed several of those bills all the way through and until they made it to the final hours of the legislative session. Photo voter ID never had a hearing, and then nothing was introduced in this year's legislative session in terms of photo voter ID or any of the other bills that had been introduced previously to roll back early voting. And so I think what we find is often that, at least using this example of New Mexico, is that when we do go on the offense and we are trying to push the expansion of voting rights, that it tends to put the opponents back on their heels, and they're really not as effective.
We will only have time for one more question. This line comes from Joyce Jones with DET.com.
Hi, thanks for doing this call. This morning, Jim Clyburn expressed the desire for the Obama administration to share some of that good ground game to help Democrats this fall. Do you agree, and what should the Democrats be expecting from the president aside from fundraising to help them not lose more seats and not lose the Senate?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things. You know, the president and his team at the White House have said that they are going to help candidates and Democrats across the country out however they can, whatever way makes the most sense. And so his personal involvement, I think, is going to vary from state to state, district to district. But there's full commitment from the president to help Democrats however he can. Beyond his personal involvement, though, I think there are a couple of things that we're seeing. We are seeing an unprecedented level of cooperation between the Democratic National Committee, the DCCC, the DSCC, the DGA, all of the committees working hand in hand across the country. Big part of that is on the data and technology front, where the president gave all of the data, all of the volunteer data, all the voter data from his 2 successful campaigns to the DNC, and the DNC is giving that to the other party committees and giving that to our candidates across the country through our Project Ivy program. That information is going to allow us, it is particularly important in lower turnout years, that it's going to allow us to identify our voters and go get them. We are, the President has also made a very strong commitment, and the administration has made a very, very strong commitment to this notion of voter protection and voter expansion, and that's why the work that Pratt's doing, working with state parties, working with other party committees, working with specific campaigns, making sure that we've got a coordinated effort to push back on these efforts to suppress the vote. We Democrats are committed to expanding that vote through voter registration as well as proactive measures to make voting easier. All these things together are how we're going to push back. But the fundamental notion is that lower turnout means that we'll lose, and so we've got to drive it up as much as possible. I'd like to close remembering a story. The weekend before the 2013 Virginia election, the McAuliffe campaign in Virginia was predicting turnout at a certain threshold, feeling pretty good about its ground game. And the chairman of the Republican Party of Virginia, talking to a reporter just 2 or 3 days before the election, said there's no way that turnout is going to be as high as the McAuliffe people predict. We believe turnout is going to be in the low 30s, and that's why we feel great. Their entire strategy is predicated on lower voter turnout. Their entire strategy is predicated on doing what they can to just turn their voters out and keep everyone else's voters at home. That's why I think long-term the Republican Party is headed, got its foot on the gas, headed straight over a cliff, because it can't survive that way. But they can cause some collateral damage along the way. That's what they're trying to do now. And you're going to see a concerted, unified voice from the Democratic Party, from the administration, and from a lot of our allies out there pushing back on that notion, because we just fundamentally believe that while it's politically helpful for us to have more voters, it is better for us as a nation to have more people participate in the process. With that, I just got the hook and told we're out of time, so I want to thank everyone. Thank you, Maggie. I know it's early out there in New Mexico, and you're running a heck of a race, and good luck to you and your part in this whole fight. But thanks all.